in September 1774. Here, in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress convened, the first meeting of delegates from the British colonies stretched along the Atlantic seacoast. They met to consider the worsening relations between the colonists and the British government overseas. In less than a year from the time the Continental Congress met here, fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, between the rebellious colonists and the red-coated troops of King George III. Ground had been broken for this building in 1770, but the hall itself was not yet finished when Congress met here in 1774. I am Mortimer Adler, and this is America's Testament. It all started here, but it did not end here. That First Continental Congress merely petitioned the king for the redress of grievances. They asked to have their rights as Englishmen restored. They went one step further. They called for an economic boycott against the importation of goods from the mother country. But they did not yet call for independence. Nor did that happen 6 months later, when in May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress met, not here, but in another Philadelphia building, the State House, a few blocks away. By that time, King George had issued a proclamation that open and avowed rebellion already existed in the colonies. Not until the following year did a growing sentiment in favor of American independence cause the Second Continental Congress, still in session, to consider drafting a Declaration of Independence. That part of the story still remains to be told.
America's Testament will explore the ideas and ideals of the Constitution that challenged the world at the birth of our republic. On this program, the two bicentennials, Mortimer Adler's guests are Professor John Hope Franklin, eminent historian from Duke University, and Walter Dellinger, professor of constitutional law, also at Duke University.
This is the first in a series of 5 programs in which we will be discussing America's Testament, the 3 great documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. In this first program, we will consider the relation of the 2 bicentennials, the bicentennial of 1976, in which we celebrated the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and the bicentennial of 1987, or 88, 89, we will celebrate formulation and adoption of the Constitution. I would like to begin today with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in 1863. In its opening sentence, Lincoln said, "Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." That proposition is, of course, declared by Jefferson to be a self-evident truth. But the question I want to ask my colleagues here about is the phrase, "a new nation." In the Declaration itself, in the closing paragraphs, the writers of the Declaration say they're representatives of the United States of America, but they also say that they are signing this document in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly published to declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. My question to you is, was Lincoln correct or incorrect in saying a new nation? The United States did not come into existence in 1776, did it?
It has once been said that we imagine the past and remember the future.
Yeah.
And in part, Lincoln is imagining a past, is conceptualizing a sense of nationhood, or at least a sense of peoplehood, as
That-
of
that's what-
1776.
That's exactly what I was wondering. It's a new people that's coming into
It's
existence.
certainly a new people, and I have read in your own work that the very thoughtful notation that the Declaration speaks of when a people need to separate themselves from another people. So there is a sense of peoplehood, but it's also the case that these were, in terms of any legal concepts, 13 independent nation states.
You agree with that?
I think they were not only separate in a legal notion or a concept, but they were separate in so many ways, distinctly so. That is not to say that they did not have a common language and some common experiences, but they, politically, of course, they were as separate as they possibly could be, and of course remained so for some years to come. As a matter of fact, I think that what they were saying in 1776 was that we're going to try to get together and create a new nation.
Well,
but
John,
they were not creating it by that time. They had not created it by that time. I like the term you used, and I hope we can explore it, peoplehood, because that tells us, I think.
Well, John Adams
Adams
wrote home to Abigail at the beginning of the Continental Congress in 75, and wrote of men meeting together, all strangers, not acquainted with each other's language, even though it was a common language, not acquainted with each other's language, ideas, views, designs. They are therefore jealous of each other, he said, fearful, timid, skittish. I mean, it is, I think, difficult for us to conceive now how hard it was for them to think of themselves as a nation. I mean, these were, I think Gary Wills points out that these were legislative, or delegates from legislative assemblies in 1776 that had 100 years of tradition. The Virginia House of Burgesses had been meeting an unbroken sequence of sessions for 150 years at the time of the Continental Congress. These colonies had been more trading rivals than partners. They were about to fight a war as allies, not as a union.
And the army that fought that war was not the army of the United States, but the Continental Army.
Continental Army.
Army responsible for the Continental Congress, right?
And made up of men who were more obligated to their separate colonies than even to the Continental Congress.
If we talk about the birth of a nation, it was not 1776 that this nation came into being, this sovereign state, which we call the United States of America. Yet, in that closing paragraph of the Declaration, they use United States in capital letters, United States of America, which I think is a mistake. They should have had lower U and lower S with a large A.
Yes, I think so. I think what we've said would indicate that they were still expressing aspirations, even at the end of the document. They were expressing aspirations more than a reality.
Now, if you take the opening words of the preamble in order to form a more perfect union, take the following dates: 1776, 1783, which is the end of the war and the beginning of the Articles of Confederation, 1787, that period between 1783 and 1787, which is the time they were, the 13 separate independent states were federated under the Articles, but no United States yet. Then 1787, 1788, 1789, 87, the time the Constitution is drafted and submitted to the people. 88, the time that 9 states have ratified it, in July or August of 88. And 89, in March, when Washington took office and Congress met for the first time. Wouldn't you date the beginning of the United States of America in March 1789?
I don't have any trouble with that. If you say that they were open for business at this point, they certainly were. I suppose that a case might be made for the completion of ratification, that is, for the time that a sufficient number of states had ratified the Constitution so that it could go into effect, and that's 1788.
But the actual government did not come into existence.
The government did not come into existence. As I said, they weren't open for business until March of 1789.
How would you express the sense that the Constitution, by creating a federal republic as it did, created a more perfect union. What was more perfect about that union than the union under the Articles of Confederation?
Well, under the Articles of Confederation, there was really no national government worthy of the name. You look at the Articles of Confederation, and it looks very much like the United Nations or NATO. In fact, when I've talked to European scholars or groups about this period, after the Revolution and before the Constitution of the United States, I say, you know, imagine NATO and the common market, and then imagine that there was considerably less economic integration than in the present common market, and probably not as much military coordination.
And much more rivalry in trade and commerce.
There was really, you know, the National Congress, so-called, was a body like an international body, not a national government. It had no power to tax. Each state legislature sent a delegate for 1 year, a delegate on a very short...
13 sovereign states.
13 sovereign states. There's no doubt about it. This government, or this Congress, it wasn't really a government, had no power to operate directly on individuals any more than the United Nations can send you a bill or make you respond to them. And, you know, that, I suppose, was not a mistake. It was the kind of government that I think the revolutionary generation was most comfortable with. And in 1776, they were fighting a war against distant, far removed rule with a government that had an executive authority in the king. And what we saw in 1776 was power located in the state legislatures.
Of course, I think what we need to remember too is that they were up to 1775 quite ambivalent on where they wanted to go.
That's right.
And what they wanted to do. There's so much evidence to support the view that if they could have just gotten a few things straightened out with the mother country, they would have gone on as they had been going on for an indefinite period of time.
If their petitions for redress of grievances had been answered, they might have remained.
Indefinitely, yes.
In fact, they might have had the status of Canada, a self-governing dominion under the
the whole concept of dominion might have come in earlier. As a matter of fact, there was discussion in Britain during the war as to what they might do to make some adjustments so that they could continue some kind of close relationship with their colonies. And if they had, they might have come up with a dominion concept in the early 1780s.
The British Commonwealth of Nations might have come into existence sooner.
That's right, that's right. I think that the point that Walter made, too, about there being strangers cannot be overemphasized.
That makes the Constitution even more remarkable, doesn't it?
Oh, it does.
Yes. I was going to say that not only were they strangers in 1775 when Adams wrote his wife, but they were still, to a considerable extent, strangers in 1787.
At the convention.
At the convention. They had the experience, of course, of some kind of cooperation, somewhat loose at times, but cooperation among them during the war itself. But can you conceive of people being more distant, in not only in terms of geography, but in terms of their history, their experiences, their day-to-day problems, than, say, the people of Georgia as opposed to the people of Massachusetts or New Hampshire?
And the travel time distance, the communication distance.
Look how long they had to wait, for people to arrive.
Those 1775 delegates who had been acquainted with one another tended overwhelmingly to have met in one city, and that city was London. Not Philadelphia or Charleston. London is where, and in part, the British quite consciously ran the colonies with a view of London as a hub with spokes going out, with London establishing separate trading relationships to keep these entities separate. And I think the cultures were quite different. When you get the vision of 1787, Dr. Adler, of the plain and simple delegate, a Roger Sherman of Connecticut, one sort of visualizes him in a black suit, and contrasting that with the Virginians riding in with horses and silks and liveried servants. And,
quite different in appearance.
Quite different.
Was the mentality of the men who met in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution the same mentality as the men who met in Philadelphia in Carpenter's Hall to write the Declaration? Was the Constitution written in the same frame of mind as the Declaration? Or are the documents different, not in mentality, but in their purposes? Comparing the two documents now, isn't the Declaration a statement of fundamental political principles? You don't find those political principles in the Constitution, leaving the amendments out now. The Constitution is an arrangement of offices, setting up a federal republic with some dual jurisdictions or dual sovereignties and dual citizenship. But is the mentality of the people who wrote those two documents the same?
Oh, I think that they perhaps were about the same. I'm not prepared at this moment to say how many men you can find who were at both places, that is in the Continental Congress and at the convention, but there is considerable overlap. But that's not the point. The point is further that they had similar aspirations and whatnot. And I want to take Walter up on the point that he made with respect to the document on the one hand being sort of free of any compromises and so forth, and on the other hand, one that is full of compromises. I think that what happened in the case of the Declaration of Independence, since it was a document of aspiration and a philosophical statement, they brushed away any possible controversial matters from the Constitution. Let's not forget that Jefferson wanted to include in the Declaration of Independence.
He tried it the first time.
Very, very serious indictment of George III for having imposed slavery on the colonies. Now that was an historical inaccuracy to begin with, but Jefferson, in the effort to throw the book at Britain, sought to accuse Britain even of establishing and imposing slavery. And Congress said, no, we won't have that.
Some delegates wouldn't have signed if...
Well, we say that. I want to talk about that at some point, not only about the Declaration, but about the Constitution itself. That is our way out of saying they wouldn't have signed. I don't know whether they would have or not. If the others had been adamant, if the others had stood their ground, for example, it would have saved the Continental Congress and the men who fought the war for independence a good deal of embarrassment had they come straight on this. And they wouldn't have had all the petitions from blacks in 1776, 77, 78 saying, look, we have as much right to freedom as you do, perhaps more. And if you're going to ask for your freedom from England, we are going to ask for our freedom from you. The point is that the Declaration itself represents a kind of glossing over of a very serious problem.
Well, the very fact that Jefferson was defeated indicates that.
Yes. He was defeated. I don't know how hard he tried, frankly, but he was defeated. And of course, those who wanted to include in the Constitution more liberal measures with respect to slavery were defeated too.
Let me add one more thing on this point. In the Declaration, three words are there: justice, liberty, and equality. In the Constitution, in the Preamble, justice and liberty are there, but not equality. Equality is not mentioned until we get to the Civil War amendments. Equal protection of the laws, the equality of citizens. Equality was not ever mentioned in the 18th century document, was it? I don't think it ever comes in.
The word equal is mentioned, as I recall, but only when it says that no state shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. But non-equality is a concept. I mean, this was not...
With the French at the same time saying liberté, égalité, fraternité.
This was not an equal culture, not just on slavery, but even within the free population.
And that's why Lincoln,
an equal culture.
who really loved the Declaration deeply, said that's not a description of fact, that's a pledge to the future. We regarded the Declaration...
What Lincoln did, and it comes through very much in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, was to take the rhetoric of the Declaration seriously.
I don't think it's rhetoric.
All men are created equal. He says, let's take that seriously. That
he says seriously, it's self-evident truth.
It's self-evident truth. And he says at one point in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, if we really believe that this principle only applies to white men, let's amend the Declaration of Independence.
By the way, women are not mentioned at all.
No, of course not.
Not only white men, but white women in general. There's no thought of women in the Declaration.
You have a male society.
Absolutely.
And a class society.
That's right.
That's why you don't get the concept of equality embedded in the Constitution itself, because there was, I think, no real deep appreciation for equality
at all
in Philadelphia in 1787.
No. But if you take the two documents, wouldn't you say that the Declaration is a statement of political principles laying down the criteria for assessing the goodness, the justice of a government, whereas the Constitution does not do that. It takes the objectives of a government when established, and those objectives are not political principles, they're goals to be achieved. But there are no political principles, strictly political principles, in the sense in which the consent of the governed is a political principle. The notion of rights, of human rights, unalienable human or natural rights is not mentioned in the Constitution, but in the Declaration. That's why I think that Lincoln thought the Declaration was the more fundamental document of the two.
I read Lincoln as saying that we need to read the Constitution in light of the Declaration of Independence.
That's my feeling, too.
You know, that there were really two views on the Constitution and slavery, to oversimplify. By 1860, William Lloyd Garrison gives up on the Constitution.
Yes.
He says it's a it's a covenant with death, an agreement made in hell. No right-thinking person should pledge allegiance to such a document. Lincoln is unwilling to accept the notion that he has to give up on the Constitution in order to oppose slavery. Lincoln takes the position that, and I think this particularly is why he goes all the way back to the Declaration and the concept of equality embedded in the Declaration, and imagines that future, because Lincoln wants to read the Constitution as the best Constitution it can be, and he wants to see it as one which at every point leans against the institution of slavery.
Well, the ideals, after all, to establish justice is the first goal after a more perfect union, and if you establish justice, you have to treat equals equally and unequals unequally. You have to secure right. The Declaration says that a just government is created to secure these rights: the rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that, in some sense, the Constitution does follow out the Declaration, doesn't it?
Well, you know, the big issue is, as far as I'm concerned, is slavery. And if you go back to the Constitution, in terms of whether the compromises with principle that are made in the Constitution as drafted at Philadelphia, and the course that John Hope Franklin and I teach together, I began by spending 7 weeks going through the Constitutional Convention at Philadelphia. Each time I have been through the records of the convention, it has seemed to me that slavery is playing a larger and larger issue, even before it comes up for actual discussion in the convention. The tensions over slavery.
Wasn't the other tension over whether or not the Constitution should have a Bill of Rights? Wasn't one of the other fighting points among the delegates was whether or not a Bill of Rights?
Not really. Not at the convention. And
the Bill of Rights is demanded more by the opponents and the critics.
The anti-federalists. The
anti-federalists.
Yeah.
But they really begin to shoot their guns after the convention is over.
It's hard for us to imagine drafting a Constitution of the United States without a Bill of Rights. But seen from the perspective of the convention itself, they are establishing a frame of government. It is not at all clear yet the way in which the institution of judicial review, anticipated in the Constitution, no doubt. It's not
Is it really anticipated there?
Absolutely. There are a dozen serious discussions at the Constitutional Convention where judicial review is clearly anticipated. The judges will invalidate laws that are inconsistent with this.
Are there clauses in the Constitution that say that?
In Article 3 of the Constitution comes, certainly acknowledges that the judicial power shall extend to all cases arising under this Constitution. One can imagine cases arising under the Constitution that do not involve the power to invalidate acts of Congress. But at a number of places in the discussions at the convention, it is assumed that the judges will have the power to invalidate laws.
That, by the way, seems to be one of the great inventions of the United States. England, with an unwritten constitution, if there's tyranny of the majority by an act of Parliament, it only can be corrected by another act of Parliament repeating that prior legislation. There's no judicial review in England. I think we're the only constitutional government in the world that has the apparatus or the device of curing the tyranny of the majority by having the Supreme Court declare that tyranny an unconstitutional law.
Right, but at the time of the Constitutional Convention, there are no national courts under the Articles of Confederation. In the convention itself, James Madison is unable even to get the convention to agree to set up lower federal courts. That has to be left to the discretion of future Congresses. So that any declaration, that's right, any declaration of rights included in the Constitution would have been seen as largely just a declaration. The enforcement mechanism wasn't fully in place and fully anticipated, and it's not that these rights were disparaged. In fact, they were assumed in many cases. At one point, Hugh Williamson of North Carolina says, we don't need to put in a provision saying that no ex post facto law can be passed. Every serious student of government knows that an ex post facto law is invalid. You don't have to explicitly state it in the Constitution.
I don't think Lincoln was terribly comfortable with the Constitution on the questions that we are discussing, and I think that that's why he begins his Gettysburg Address as he does, and that's why he goes back for his inspiration and for guidance to the Declaration of Independence, which from his point of view in 1863 is more usable than the Constitution itself. He was deeply, deeply troubled about the protections that the Constitution provided to institutions that he did not support, such as the institution of slavery. So that instead of attacking the Constitution, he turned it over. He turned his attention to the Declaration.
Let me ask, we know that constitutional government began in the 6th century BC in the Little Greek city-states. Solon gave a constitution to Athens, Lycurgus to Sparta. There were written constitutions. Aristotle had 130 of them. Only one of his constitutions are left. And so the constitutional government is not an American invention. No. Nor, as a matter of fact, is the having a convention of men to draft a constitution, because between 1776 and 1783, I think 6 states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, Massachusetts, maybe more than that, held constitutional conventions, so that the idea of having a constitutional convention was not new. What was novel, don't you think, about the Philadelphia Convention was the creation not of constitutional government by a convention of men, but the creation of a federal republic. Is it not true that this is the first federal republic in the history of the world, having dual sovereignty, the sovereignty of the national government, the sovereignty of the several states, dual citizenship, citizen of North Carolina, citizen of the United States? Isn't that the great innovation?
I think that's a fair statement.
I think so.
Remember how difficult it is to bring about this new concept, to make it really work, and I don't think it really does work until after 1865. I mean, you see at the Constitutional Convention the tension over the issue of slavery, which breaks out towards the end of the convention in August. In August, Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania makes a thunderous denunciation of slavery at the convention. I'm interested in asking Dr. Franklin to what extent it is fair to see the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, or a document indeterminate
negatively,
on
it's not an anti-slavery document. I don't think it's a pro-slavery document. It admits, it acquiesces in slavery. It doesn't endorse it. It acquiesces in it, don't you think?
Oh, I think it goes a little beyond acquiescence. I really do. For whatever reasons, I think we can get into an argument about why it is, but I have no problem with the fact that it is. Anytime you have a document that undertakes to protect slavery in the same way that it protects other property,
Yes.
is for that form of property,
Yeah.
which happens to be slavery at that time. You can't run away without getting the machinery of the government on the side of the owner for the rendition of the runaway. A slave is not a person in the sense of being counted as a person, the way other people are, for representation and purposes of taxation and so forth. They're not. And then, of course, the fact that the Constitution says that the importation of slaves shall not end before 20 years after the date of ratification.
Right.
It does not require to end then. Under the Constitution, slavery could have existed until 1987. There's nothing in the Constitution that prevents it from doing it. Now, this is a very supportive set of arrangements, and when they get that supportive, I would say it's pro. It's as much pro-slavery as it is pro-chattel of any other kind.
But let me ask you, though, wouldn't you say that the 19th Amendment, which recognized the equality of women with men as in their political status, that no one shall be deprived of citizenship and suffrage by reason of gender or sex, is as radical a step toward human equality as the post-Civil War amendments, and the abolition of slavery and the establishment of suffrage for blacks?
Probably so, but the whole matter of the women was not before the convention.
Oh, no, I know.
In the way that slavery was. Slavery was, you see. It was a given that women were not going to have anything.
The issue of slavery was, you know, it's not an issue that slipped past an unsuspecting convention. It's not an issue that, for its time, was beyond the critical competence of these people. Now, I would note that, I mean, the Constitution's deep ambivalence on slavery is at least reflected by the fact that it was literally unspeakable. That is, they would not mention the name of it.
That's right.
And
that is, though.
I know that's minor, but it does.
No, I don't think it is minor. I think it's very major. I think it was a deliberate
I think
thing,
so too,
because it was unspeakable. They knew it, and yet they supported it. You see, this is where you get fairly close to hypocrisy from my point of view, because although the terminology is convoluted and very weird and that sort of thing, and they don't use the term, but when you read those provisions, you know what they're talking about, you see. And why wouldn't they say? Slave. Why wouldn't they use it?
Well, Lincoln is able to use the fact that they are ashamed even to say the name of slavery as an argument that the Constitution should not be read as giving any special protection to slavery. That is contrary to Roger Brooke Tawney and Dred Scott. There's no reason why Congress could not abolish slavery in the territories, in Lincoln's view. Frederick Douglass does note at one point that you could do away with slavery without having to change a word of the Constitution. You would certainly have to change the way that Roger Brooke Tawney and many other people had read it.
How could you do that? How would Douglass?
Well, certainly states themselves could abolish it. The national government could have prohibited any interstate shipment or transportation of slaves, could have, properly read, forbade slavery in the territories.
Let me ask you another question. We said a moment ago, we agreed that the great innovation in 1783 was the creation of the Federal Republic. There were Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalist in the 18th century, Hamilton is the great Federalist, really, is for a strong national government rather than, shall I say, prevalence or the predominance of the sovereignty of the several states. Would you say that in the 20th century, when a man like President Reagan talks about the new federalism, he's the very opposite of Hamilton? He's asking for less concentration in the national government and more provision of authority and power in the states, is he not? Isn't federalism in the 20th century the very opposite of federalism in the 18th, if Hamilton is the great federalist?
I think that what we have now is an effort to return to what the pro-New Federalists today perceive to be the situation, let's say, in the late 18th century. It is where you had less power exercised by the federal government and more exercised by the several state governments. I think what the New Federalists want to do is to use their term, get the government off the backs of the people. That is, get the federal government, reduce the power of the federal government and return it to some point of weakness, which they would call weakness back in the 18th century. I don't know that it would antedate, though, what you have, say, at the time of the launching of the government in 1789. For at that point, the government, while it was a federal republic to be sure, its powers were, in the minds of most people, rather limited.
In the first 9 Federalist papers, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay argue for this more perfect union on the grounds that without it, there would not be peace on this continent. They talk about the ever-present war among the sovereign states of Europe, and it would be exactly the same on the eastern seaboard if New Jersey and New York went to war about fishing rights, so that they were concerned with the civil peace being created by civil government here, a national government. In 1910, Theodore Roosevelt in Kansas, at the burial place of John Brown, gave a speech called The New Nationalism, which is, again, an attempt to assert the strength of the national government over the states in economic matters. So that we have a continual, I think, from the very beginning, though less, I think, in the 20th century than earlier, the conflict between the states and the national government, would you say? It's diminishing now?
Oh, yes, it has diminished. I think, as Walter said, I think the watershed was the Civil War and the period after that. Now, we get a lot of talk, and I must say, I think it's at the level of talk and not beyond that about the rights of the states. We have had interposition in recent years, and we've had nullification, or it's some synonym for it in recent years. But I think it's largely has been at the level of talk,
rhetoric,
and sort of rhetoric in the 20th century. After the Civil War, after the Reconstruction Amendments, you've got another ball game, so to speak, in terms of the strength, the overriding strength of the central government, as opposed to the several state governments. And the federalism is something very powerful after that time. I think Lincoln certainly was important, but Marshall, for example, had laid the groundwork. I don't want to get into this beyond observing and passing that certainly he strengthened the concept of federalism more than anyone else, I think, between, say, the time of the launching of our government in 1789 and the Civil War.
Marshall was an aide-de-camp to George Washington at Valley Forge when soldiers were facing frostbite and starvation and malnutrition because the states were not sending in their requisitions, and there was no power in the Continental Congress to enforce it. And at least one of Marshall's biographers speculates that this was a very searing experience. The notion that you could be fighting a war without any true national government to get the kind of resources you needed to support the troops, and that you sometimes see that reflected in John Marshall's opinion. I know that Charles Black of Yale says the greatness of Marshall is in taking the disconnected passages of the various articles of the Constitution and reading them with a very distant future vision of nationhood. He sees this as creating a nation. And in McCulloch against Maryland, on the powers of Congress, he speaks of a constitution designed to govern a nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the St. Croix to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, when you think of where the population was in 1820, the time of 1860, the time of McCulloch against Maryland, huddled along the eastern seaboard with even the Appalachian Mountains being a formidable barrier, the idea that someone like John Marshall can speak seriously and eloquently in terms of a nation that stretches to the Pacific. That's a vision of empire and republic. And he reads the Constitution as a constitution for a nation that large.
Your mentioning Marshall makes me want to ask the question. You said earlier, Mr. Dillinger, that the power of judicial review is implicitly contained in the clauses of the Constitution. Would you attribute to Marshall the making of that power explicit? Is
Yes.
Marshall the author, in the sense, the innovator in this respect?
It seems to me that while judicial review was clearly anticipated by the framers of Philadelphia, and there's no doubt of that. Let me just say one word on that. There is a discussion in the Constitutional Convention of whether there ought to be a council of revision that vetoes acts of Congress made up of some of the judges and the president acting together. And delegate after delegate says that would be inappropriate because the judges will have the authority to pass on the constitutionality of the laws when they exercise judicial review. And you shouldn't give them a double negative. I mean, it's stated again and again. And there are other examples where it's anticipated. But by the time that Marbury versus Madison comes before the court, the prestige of the court is not great. It's not a very distinguished appointment. Judicial review is a theoretical idea. It has only been exercised sparingly. It has its source ultimately in the notion that the Constitution is law, that is real law, the kind of law that a litigant can invoke in court and rest his or her case
a
upon.
special kind of law, not made by a legislature, but we the people, the constituents.
But law itself, and therefore the kind of law that you can use in court. But it's up to John Marshall to seize the moment to, in a sense, actualize the role of the courts, to breathe life in the theoretical possibility of a judicial role in protecting vested rights. And he does that, and I think certainly Marshall is one of the central founders of the American Republic we know today.
We talked about the Constitution, the Declaration, and Lincoln. Lincoln's phrase, I think, is a stroke of genius: government of the people, by the people, and for the people. As I discuss that document, I find that most people don't know what the word "of" means. It means the people's, like as in the French, the hat of my aunt's hat, the people's government, of the people, not that they're being governed, but it is their government. That, it seems to me, that notion, along with the notion of the consent of the governed, is the essence of constitutional government, that it proceeds from the popular sovereignty. In which case, I keep saying that the government of the United States is not in Washington. The administration of the government is here, or wherever we are, the people. Wherever the people are, they are the people, the citizens, being now by the people, the citizens, with suffrage, those who are governed with their own consent, and with participation in government by suffrage. They are the permanent and principal rulers of this country. The officers, those citizens who for a time being hold public office by election or appointment, are the temporary and instrumental rulers. So that we oughtn't to speak of the government in Washington. We ought to speak of the administration of the government in Washington. Wouldn't you say, for example, in a national election, we don't change the government, we change the administration? But most Americans don't think that way. They think of themselves as the ruled and the office holders in Washington as the rulers. That seems to be incorrect. Wouldn't you say so?
I would say so, and taking it a bit further, I would say that this notion of the people being the government, I think it comes up in the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, definitely.
You see, the government must operate with the consent of the government, you see. And so that, and I think it was the
Deriving its just powers from the consent of the government.
I think it was the distance of this country from Britain that helped them to develop this notion that they must have self-government, you say, or they must govern themselves. Now, if you can divorce yourself then from a government way over across the Atlantic Ocean, then you will move to the next step of governing yourself, the people's government, And that makes it possible for you to say in the Constitution, we the people, you see.
Yeah.
And it makes it possible for you and me to say today that the government is not in Washington,
but it's with us.
but it's with us, you see.
That's right.
It's a line of reasoning and thinking that starts from there.
I think having the American public understand that is of the greatest importance. They don't understand
and
it.
no, the Constitution, the national government is constructed in such a way that no one branch or institution can purport to speak for the people.
Yeah.
The fact that we have a House elected for 2 years, a Senate elected for 6 years, a president for 4 years, with overlapping and interchanging terms, means that a political movement, if it's going to succeed in this country, has to win a succession of elections. And it also means that since in different ways these various branches rest on some kind of legitimate underpinnings, no one group of authorities can purport to speak of the whole voke or people. We don't cede to any government all of our governing rights. We give bits and pieces of it here and there to different branches for different amounts of time.
The only way the government itself, not the administration, which changes with elections, the only way the government itself can be changed is by the people voting for amendments. The government is changed by amendment, is it not? I mean, if the Constitution, so that again that comes from the people, not from the Congress or from the office holders. And Lincoln had a very profound sense of the office holder. He always said, I'm a servant of the people. As President of the United States, I'm a servant of the people, which I think that notion is terribly important to get clear.
It's terribly important, but I think we ought to remember how difficult it is, too, for the average person to conceptualize that role for himself. That is the role of himself as government, you see. It's extremely difficult.
Under constitutional government in a republic, we've seen that the citizens are the ruling class. All office holders must be citizens. Citizenship is the primary office. The President of the United States is a secondary office. He has to be citizen first. Under despotic governments, the ruled are subjects. They have no voice in their own government. They're not governed with their consent. And so under despotic government, no one is concerned with the education of the subjects. Erasmus, for example, in the Renaissance, writes a book called The Education of the Prince, and that kind of book is written again and again. But we're concerned with citizens who are the ruling class, and a statement by Horace Mann, the great New England educator in the middle of the century, I'd like to read to you. He said, "The establishment of a republican government without well-appointed and efficient means for the effective education of the people is the most rash and foolhardy experiment ever tried by man." Now, that's middle of the 19th century. In the 20th century, when we have universal suffrage for the first time, it seems to be even more true that we have the problem of educating our people, our young people who are going to become citizens. Would you say that the preparation for citizenship should include, at the minimal, the reading of these basic documents and the understanding of them?
Oh, sure. Self-governing people have to be an educated people, and they have to have a sense of their own authority and capacity to rule.
I think one of the things we ought to remember is that Horace Mann was speaking out of experience.
Yes.
For he saw the growth of manhood suffrage. It had not become universal, but he saw the increase in suffrage in the Jacksonian period, and he sees what's been going on. And what he sees is the increase in political power and the exercise of that power by people whose educational system is not up to standard. So what takes place is the usurpation of power by demagogues and by others to control the government and to control the people. So that he is so right that any Republican government must have an educated citizenry to avoid disaster.
Here we are in 1987, 88, 89, with I say, a still uneducated people, in the sense that our schools are not doing the job that Horace Mann had in mind for all the future citizens. I've been around the country the last 2 or 3 years, 4 years, conducting seminars on these documents, and I find there isn't a high school student anywhere who has read the Declaration of Independence, who's read the Constitution, who can understand the meaning of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. These three documents, which are the American Testament, should be read and understood by every future citizen. But wouldn't you go further than that? Wouldn't you ask them to read the Federalist Papers? Wouldn't you ask them to read the great judicial decisions? Don't they have to have an understanding of the principles and development of this government to be citizens?
I think that maybe we're not being careful about our definition of education.
I'm talking about schooling, basic schooling,
yes,
K through 12.
Yes.
Not even college, K through 12 I'm talking about.
And I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the kind of education that is not necessarily geared to a set of school grades.
No, nothing to do with school.
But a kind of education that is continuing, that may involve not merely youngsters, but oldsters too, if they haven't had it yet, you see. Of course, our educational system ought to do something about this. But I think that we as citizens ought to do something about it.
For ourselves.
Ourselves and for our peers, our colleagues, or what have you. I'm really not disagreeing with you. I'm going beyond. I'm trying to go beyond.
I wish you would.
To suggest that what we need, it seems to me, is a kind of continuing sensitizing of people to the importance not only of these documents, but of government and of their role in government, so that they can function effectively and successfully. Yes, Walter's right. If a person has enough good common sense and reasons well and is critical in his thinking, then he's prepared to make a judgment about candidates for office and that sort of thing. And how he gets that, I don't know. I know that he can get it in several different ways. That's what I'm.
Well, there are lots of sources usually in one's community for that information. I just want to be careful, though. I fully agree that we need an educated citizenry. Not to ever have that run backwards and say at any time in our history the fact that any segment of our population isn't fully educated means that they should be cut out of the political process. And I understand you're not saying that. I understand.
I'm only saying it seems to me that they are better citizens if these fundamental ideas, the idea of equality, the idea of liberty, the idea of what political liberty is, what human rights are, what the meaning of rights, what it means to say the pursuit of happiness, what it means to talk about the consent and dissent of the governed, the dissent of the governed as well as the consent. And think of those clauses in the preamble. Justice, domestic tranquility or civil peace, common defense, promotion of the general welfare.
It is a concern. If you look at how involved in the public life of the community people were in 1787, it is truly extraordinary.
The word
the
people
range.
Is not the. You use the word. We always must remember that the people is not the population.
I understand.
The people of the 4 million people on the eastern seaboard in 1783, I would guess a very small percentage were the people, that population. The people now and the population are almost coextensive, with the exclusion only of infants below the age of consent, those hospitalized for mental inadequacy, and criminals, felonious criminals in prison. The people, that's very recent. That's almost, that sense of peoplehood is late 20th century. But that peoplehood must now be, I think, given a kind of schooling that these basic ideas are understood by all of them. Wouldn't you agree to that?
Yes, no question about it. I have absolutely no problem with that. What worries me is that in this process of education, we need to make certain that there are portions, even of the preamble, say, that are terribly important in giving us a kind of philosophy or basis for our relationship with others. To promote the general welfare, for example.
That's right.
Yes,
If we were to do that, if we were to take that seriously, we would divest ourselves of some of this selfishness, some of this lack of concern for the general welfare that we see all too much around us these days, so that it's not, I hope that when we get deep in the education of our students, our citizens, we not only will work with them on, on Article 1, Section 10, or whatever, but we'll also talk about these great principles that underlie these documents that will do something about the relationship of human beings with each other.
But you see, you both are college professors as I was, but more than half the population doesn't go to college. I think this must be done in basic school. Nothing I could say would exaggerate how it fails to create citizens. We talk about, Horace Mann would be shocked at what we're doing now, I think, when we now have 12 years of compulsory schooling. He only had 6 in his day. The notion of peoplehood that we began with seems to me requires a schooling of the people that we don't have.
Well, let me ask you this. How, with all of the expenditure of resources and energies in our educational system today, what is it we need to do to bring this kind of opportunity for learning these documents and the principles of government to our students?
You've asked me a question that would take an hour to answer, I think. I am heading up an educational reform that would introduce into the schools the discussion of these documents, because lecturing about them doesn't do the trick. They must be read and discussed, questions must be raised, the student's mind must be engaged in it. Where we've done it, it's been very successful. Thank you very much, Professor Franklin, for being with us, and Professor Dillinger. And I also want to thank our viewers for being with us on this occasion. I hope you'll be with us again for the second program in this series on America's Testament, the program in which we will examine the fundamental political ideas in the Declaration of Independence.